Hello there and welcome back to another video here on Wristwatch Revival. My name is Marshall. Thank you so much for coming along. This time on the bench, we've got a really cool little watch from a company called Charles & Co. Liverpool. I don't know anything about it. That is not a major watch brand. And this is kind of like maybe an early independent watch of sorts. This belongs to a friend of mine who inherited it from a distant family member who lived in England. And she actually had to fly over there to get this thing, brought it back home, and it's not working. So it's ended up on my bench. We're going to try to figure out whatever we can figure out about it and also try to get it running. You can see it says Charles & Co. Liverpool on the dial. And look at this. It's in the original box. Charles & Co. opposite the Central Station, Liverpool. How cool is that? An old jeweler built this watch. And as you can see, we tracked down a little bit from the London Gazette. They would list when companies would like change hands, and it looks like around 1925 that happened here too. So maybe a little bit of a hint. And here we have a picture of my friend's great uncle's grandmother actually wearing the watch. This picture was dated 1964, and she passed away in 1965, just a year later. We believe that her mother bought the watch originally, and if so, that could actually put us into that mid-1920s sort of age range. So this is what we have to do to kind of figure out what's going on with these watches because, this isn't a major brand. So yeah, that's what we're going to do today on the channel here. We're going to kind of put any of our troubles aside and focus in on restoring a little piece of history and a family heirloom that happens to be gorgeous, by the way. I mean, look at the design on this. It is really cool. It's gold, the case, and it's just got such little charm to it. But as I mentioned, unfortunately, it's not running. My friend would love to have it restored back to running condition while still keeping its age intact. And let's take a look. Ooh, look at that. A beautiful little movement in here. And right away, I can see that this movement was made by a company called Sima. And they were actually a company that made a lot of movements during this time frame. You can also see that the balance wheel spins with a little bit of air, but not freely. That could be a problem. Also, we'll note that there's no shock protection on the top of the jewel. And so it's good that that balance wheel is spinning because that shock protection is basically like a system that spring loads that wheel up. And that way, if you drop it, it doesn't snap the main part of it. That's pretty common to happen on watches like this that don't have shock protection. So it's nice to see that that's not the case here. This really does remind me of a pocket watch, by the way. It's like a little tiny baby pocket watch, which makes sense. That's kind of the direction that watches went. And if this watch is from the 20s, this would be the time frame when wristwatches were becoming more popular. They were actually already introduced for women before that. They were called wristlets, but they weren't popular with men until after World War I. And we'll start by just removing these hands here. This is a watch, a style of watch we call a two-hander. It only has two hands. There's no seconds hand. So when you look at the face of it, it's very elegant because it appears unmoving, right? There's no ticking or anything spinning around. It's just a very clean look. And we can set those aside and take the movement out. And one clue that we're going to be able to get here most likely is by looking at the case itself. Cases in England have to be taken to an assayer's office. And as you can see, this one was. So that stamp right there is actually a leopard. That means that this was in London. That N that you see is actually the year code. And after looking it up, it is 1928. .375 designates how much of the case is gold. In this case, that's 9 karat. And LA at the bottom is what they call the maker's mark. And I wasn't able to find who LA is, but that would be the maker. There's a serial number, and then that 9 at the top, I don't know what it means. And you can see all these little scratched in numbers on the side. If you've ever seen those on my videos and wondered what they are, those are watchmakers marks. So when you would take your watch in to get serviced, they would scratch in a code or a little date or something like that to show who had worked on it and what they had done so that there was a record of it. I'm sure you've noticed that on my videos, I don't do that. I actually don't like that practice. I don't really want to put my marks onto somebody else's watch. I think these watches carry a story for the people that owned them. And that to me is good enough. But at any rate, that was the practice of the day. So this watch had been serviced multiple times. Okay, after taking the movement out of the case, taking the cannon pinion off the back, we can now what we call let down the mainspring. I'm sorry to let you down, mainspring, but you can't have any power in you because when I take apart the rest, we can't have spring-loaded elements in this thing ready to send parts flying into the walls or out the window. And if you've hung out with me for a while, you've seen that that can happen on occasion. Hopefully not too often, though. We'll start by taking off the balance. The balance is made up of a few parts here, but they tend to incorporate a few of the most delicate elements of a watch, and especially a very old one like this. So now we've got it dated to late 20s, early 30s. I want to be extra careful with that because sometimes the parts can be hard to find. And also for a piece like this, I find it important to try to keep as many original parts in it as possible. Remember, this type of watch isn't going to be a daily wear type scenario. The owner of the watch wants to keep it as a family heirloom and have it running properly, maybe even wear it for special occasions. But this isn't the type of thing that you just throw on and run out the door. It's a gold watch. Yeah, it's 9 karat. It's not, insanely valuable in that way, but it's delicate, right? And it would be something that you'd want to kind of take out only for special occasions. The movement, though, is interesting in the sense that this is how this worked back then. It would never come across a company's mind to make their own movement unless they were a full-on watch factory, in Switzerland. Instead, if you were a smaller company like this Charles & Co. Liverpool, you would go to Switzerland and say, I'm going to build a watch. I'm going to have the case made, right? We saw when we looked at the Assayers marks on there, that the case maker was LA, that was their initials. And we're going to put a movement inside of it. What can you give us? Then they would probably go have the dial made somewhere else as well as the hands. And then they would bring all of those parts in, assemble them using their jewelers at the jewelry store, and then they could put them out for sale under their own brand name. Wow, that center wheel did not come out freely. That's probably a good part of the reason why this watch isn't running. What happens is there's lubricants, oils that are used, especially some of the older ones, which were animal-based and, maybe not so good as the synthetic ones that we have now. When they would dry up, they become very tacky. And if the watch isn't running, the wheels can get seized up. And if it is, it can even be worse than that. The wheels can turn and that tacky oil will attract any dirt or dust. And then the wheels turning up against dirt or dust, which, as you might imagine, is not ideal for a watch movement. So the fact that this watch probably hasn't been worn or used in years is actually a benefit in this case. Flipping the movement over, we can take apart what we call the keyless works here. This is the part of the watch that's responsible for winding it as well as setting the hands. Yeah, there's something so cool about these small, this Charles & Co. across from the central station in Liverpool, right? Like you can just picture this person walking in there, shopping around, ending up buying this watch. It stays in the family. It gets handed down. And then, through kind of a weird turn of events here, so many years later, we're pushing 100 years since this watch was made. It ends up over here in the United States where I live and in the hands of my friend who now has this watch and is going to be the caretaker for it going forward. And, you can't imagine that the person who walked in to buy this at the jewelry store would have known that this watch would still be something that was important, to the family this all these years later. One of the many reasons I love this hobby. We can put the balance back on. Again, kind of funny, but putting the balance back on now actually does protect it because it keeps everything aligned and protected. And that way I can put this into the watch cleaning machine. And this watch is going to need a thorough cleaning after having not been serviced for, it looks like, I wouldn't be surprised if it's been 50 years, since this thing's been serviced. Maybe more. Okay, so that looks good. And also is running a lot more freely. So that's promising. Now we can take out the mainspring. This is the last part that we need to take apart before we turn our attention to cleaning. Okay. Well, people often over oil mainsprings, and this one looks like it was, but that doesn't hurt us here. It does protect against corrosion. Makes the mainspring a little sticky and maybe not perform quite as well, but we'll take it here. Now you see it has an old school mainspring. It's circular. That's how mainsprings used to be designed. That's the most simple one, but they did realize at some point later that if you make them in more of an S shape, you get even more power out of them. Taking a look on the microscope now at some of the parts, and yeah, so if you look closely, you can see dried on oil sitting right on top of that jewel, actually on both sides of it. Yep, here too. These should be clear, glass clear. Uh-oh. Oh, we've got a problem here. Okay, let me turn on the light from the bottom so you can see, and I'll even get a bit closer. Oh yeah, so this jewel is cracked. That is destroyed. So that means that this watch was very likely dropped. And I'm going to have to replace that jewel. We're not going to be able to run this watch like that. I'm still using this pegwood just to try to scrape off any of the dried on oil, but it's really dried on. Still, that being said, now we found out what's wrong. The watch was in really desperate need of a service. That dried on oil wouldn't even come off with the stick, so I'm going to have to probably run it through the watch cleaning machine a couple of times, or maybe even the ultrasonic cleaner. And then 2, there was a cracked jewel. And again, remember what I said before about the shock protection system? This doesn't have that, and that means that the shock of a drop can go right into a jewel. And while jewels they're second highest on the hardness scale, just below diamonds, typically that means that the harder a substance is, the more brittle it is, and therefore the more likely to crack under pressure. And that's what happened here. Okay, well, let's put the watch into the watch cleaning machine. This will take it through a 3-step cleaning process to dissolve any of that leftover oil. And while it goes through that, I did want to give a shout out to my supporters on Patreon. I have a Patreon for this channel if you're interested in supporting it. If you like what I do here and you want to see it keep going, Patreon's a place to do so. There's a link in the description. And I just wanted to say thanks to each and every person who has taken the time to support me on there. It means the world to me. And I really, really thank you. If you do sign up as well, you get a thank you card and a Wristwatch Revival sticker in the mail at any level as my way to say thank you. We can put now the case into the ultrasonic. This is all I'm going to do. This is a classic case of, you don't want to polish these type of things because these have the wear and the really cool kind of vibe that you can only get from having something just exist on this planet for a long time. Take a look at the movement. Now that it's all been cleaned up, this is about as simple as watch movements get. That's probably the least amount of parts that you're going to have. Remember, this watch doesn't even have a seconds hand. And there you can see that cracked jewel now. It's destroyed, but that's what jewels are supposed to look like after they've been cleaned. Isn't that much better? They don't have, there we go. We don't have all that extra gunk sitting on them that needs to be cleaned off. And the watch cleaning machine did a stellar job here. Did notice one other little thing. Do you see the little chip missing? Right there on the pallet fork jewel, you can see it. There you go. That probably was also the result of when it got dropped. So we'll be looking to replace that. And as you can see, I have got a replacement here. Now this is the entire main plate for a replacement. And that means that we're going to need to take just the part that we need, because I don't want to replace the whole plate. I just want to replace that one jewel. And so we're going to use our jeweling tool for this. So this is a special tool that's made to remove and replace jewels, because there's 2 things that need to happen when you do this. One of them is you need to be able to just take out the jewel, right? So that's a pretty simple operation. But when you think about it, when you put it back in, and you can see I'm going to use this special pusher from the top here to take out just that one jewel. But when you put them back in, they have to be at the right depth. I know that sounds weird, right? You think, well, just stick it back in there and it'll be fine. But if you push it in too far, the wheels won't actually sit inside. And if it's not far in enough, then the wheels won't. Now you can watch here. I'm going to remove this jewel. And there. So now it comes out. And the way this tool is designed is that it'll just fall through that hole. And then it'll just be underneath the tool on the bench. Right there. And we can take a quick look. There it is. So that's the new old jewel that we want to use. So that's one from a donor movement. And this is now the current movement that we're working on. And so now, of course, I need to take out the cracked and broken jewel. So I'm going to do the exact same procedure here. These are what they call friction fit, which just means that they're pressed into place. There's no glue. They're not threaded. They're just held in by friction. But that does mean that the manufacturing tolerances need to be very, very close. About 1/100 of a millimeter extra is all you need to make sure that it will fit in snugly. So here's the jewel from the donor movement. And what I was saying before is the cool part about these jeweling tools is not only do they allow you to flatly press in the jewel, but they also make it so that you can get the depth just right. Okay, so there we go. Now the jewel's been put back into place. And again, this gauge lets me put it back to the same depth, or at least as close as I can get to what it was before. It also lets me tweak it if I do feel that I need to. So now what we need to do is test to make sure that it's correct. So that jewel was on the escape wheel, which is what I'm putting back in here. And I'm going to put it in by itself and then put the bridge that goes over it on top. And that way we can make sure that the wheel is spinning freely, and we can check what we call the end shake, which means that we can measure or feel how high up and down the wheel's able to go, because they actually do have a little bit of play built into them. So let's test that first. Good. You can see how it moves just up and down slightly, but not too much. And we'll use an air blower. Hey, look at that. Now we've got that thing spinning freely, and that for sure was contributing to why this watch wasn't running, and gives us a much better chance of getting it running again. Okay, so now we need to transition over to the reassembly. The first thing we'll do is put this mainspring back in. I am going to reuse the mainspring on this watch. Now, this is a decision point because we absolutely could try to track down a replacement, and the watch probably would run even a bit better with a new one, as these old mainsprings do get a little tired over time. But again, given how this watch is going to be used by the owner, I decided that keeping the old mainspring would be appropriate here, because it means that even more of the original watch is intact. And of course, if the owner ever changed her mind, well, we could do that too. Now we get to do one of my favorite parts about rebuilding a watch. We get to put this mainspring back in the barrel. It's all that energy tied up, right? It's ready to be unleashed. And we get to click it back in here. It's the little things in life, right? All right, now we can put the mainspring, the arbor back in the mainspring barrel here. This is what hooks onto that mainspring so that when you wind up your watch, it actually pulls it around. Make sure that it's ready to go. A little bit of oil here on the top as well, where it meets the lid, which we'll be replacing shortly. You'll see that I've got 4 different types of oils that I use on watches like this. Mainly 3, but I do have an extra, and then technically I even have an extra one beyond that as well. But the easy way to think about it is like t-shirt sizes, right? Small, medium, and large. Small oil for very light applications where you need a really kind of a thin oil to lubricate but not slow down the works. Medium for medium, and then large would be like a grease, right? Like it's something for when there's metal being held under tension and rubbing up against each other, and you want to make sure that no little bits of metal are flaking off. And I'll tell you which ones I'm using as we go. We'll start off though by rebuilding this movement, which, by the way, I did look up the movement. This is a CYMA 030, which was produced for a good like 5 years back then. And guess what? It also aligns to that exact time frame again, late 20s, early 30s. So our detective work really paid off here. I put a little bit of the medium oil on that center wheel. And basically, you just want to have everything as lined up as possible. I'm going to put a little bit of the grease, the large, if you will, here on this setting lever screw. And I'm just going to put that in place now, and that way when I put the bridges on top, one of them actually goes over that. In fact, this one here does. And it's a pretty common mistake when you first start out to forget to do that and then have to take this back off and redo it later. And I can just put a little bit of pressure on the mainspring barrel just to make sure that everything's lined up before I screw anything down. As you might imagine, if any of those, we'll call them axles, are out of alignment and you try to screw it down, it'll just snap them. This one's particularly important because you can see the 3 jewels on the top. Those are 3 holes that those air quote axles need to go into. And we need to make sure that they're all lined up before we do anything that applies pressure to them. And that's what you want to see. And you can see how much freer this is spinning now. Remember before when I took it apart and that wheel in the middle actually was like I had to pull it out of there. It was stuck. Now it's spinning freely. So that's another promising sign that we can get this watch back and running again. Okay, we can continue the rebuild here on the top part of the movement. Again, the red stuff is the medium. And I'm going to put a little bit here where the metal meets the metal. This is called the crown wheel. It's beautiful. You can see that when this Charles & Co. company got this movement from Cyma, they either ordered a nice one. Usually when you order movements kind of in bulk, you can get them where they don't have any finishing on them at all. Perhaps if you want the cheapest option and you're not going to look at the movement anyway, or perhaps you're going to bring it in-house and do the finishing yourself. You may have watchmakers that you employ that you feel can do the finishing the way you want better. Or you can buy the movement from the manufacturer with some finishing already done on it. And that's what it looks like was done here. You can see the top of those 2 wheels that have that beautiful kind of pattern that's called snailing. And it's applied by a machine, but by hand, if that makes sense. The person has to operate the machine to apply it properly, but it is done with a machine. Okay, so we can tighten down both of those and flip the movement over. And now we can use a little bit of our medium viscosity oil and put the cannon pinion back on. Although, yeah, we'll have to revisit that. That felt like it went on quite easily and it should be under some amount of tension. But we'll revisit that in a minute because right now we can continue with the keyless works. Again, I mentioned this before, but that's the part of the watch that's responsible for both winding, but also setting the hands. It's dual purpose. And it uses this part to accomplish that. It's called the sliding clutch. And a clutch is, in mechanical terms, is something that connects one thing to another. And so the way this works is if the crown, the little thing you wind on the side of your watch, is pushed all the way in, then it'll wind up the watch. If you pull the crown out, the clutch actually slides over and engages with where the hands are. And so now when you turn it, the hands turn around and you're not winding the watch anymore. So it has a dual purpose. It's a really cool design. Okay, we can put the yoke into place and the yoke spring will follow it up as well. And this thing's coming together nicely. You can see the yoke spring, I actually left it installed on this. It's a really cool yoke spring. Usually they're just like a wire spring, but this one's formed out of metal. Also, it would be very difficult to replace without having a whole new movement. Now, in this case, I actually did. So if it were to break, I have a little backup plan, but I still just want to be careful again and just try to keep this as original as I can. And now I'm going to put on the setting lever spring. This kind of holds everything together and also provides that tension. Remember when I was just talking about how you pull out the crown on your watch and you can feel it kind of click? This is the spring that gives that tension on that click so that it'll stay in one position or the other. And watch, I'll do it here, there. So that's that clicking sound or clicking feel that you get when you set that part on your watch that you might have. By the way, if you don't have a watch like this, don't worry. That makes you pretty normal. Most people that watch a channel don't. Now I can put... Oh, no. So I'm going to try to put on the minute wheel, but I realized that it actually goes underneath the setting spring, and there is no way for me to slide it under there. So before I do, I'll also remember that there's a jewel here that I'm going to oil that goes underneath the minute wheel, which goes underneath the setting lever spring, which I now need to take off again because I did not put it on first. No big deal. This will just take a minute, and I'll put the minute wheel in right there. That's what sets the ratio for the minute hand to turn around once every hour. And now with that back and buttoned up and everything looking good, I'm going to take a look at this cannon pinion because this is supposed to have tension. It's supposed to click into place. And as you can see, it's just freely sliding. That is not right. And the watch will not run. In fact, the hands won't turn if that's the case. So we need to tighten up this cannon pinion. And I've got a special tool for it. These are just, like clippers on the front, but they have those two wheels on the side that allow you to set exactly how far they'll go down. And just like that, I can barely crimp the edges of that cannon pinion so that I can provide a little bit of tension. And let's see if it clicks into place now. There we go. See, that's what we wanted to see. And that also can be another reason why the watch wouldn't run. The interesting part is the watch actually would run under that scenario, but the hands wouldn't turn. So you may not know that it was running. And of course, it's non-functional in that case. Now, I took the pallet fork here also from the other movement that I got to replace that jewel. And that way we can replace the chipped pallet fork here as well, as that can affect the running of the watch. And especially, I don't want it to get worse. There we go. Everything's lined up. Now I can screw it into place and put a wind in the watch, and the moment of truth arrives. We can take the balance and see if this watch will spring back to life or if we've got more work to do. So let's find out. And just make sure everything's lined up and see if this thing's going to run. Ooh, it kicked right up. Look at that. Oh, beautiful. That is exactly what you want to see, especially when the watch wasn't even running. Now, it does look like it's a little low on amplitude. It's not swinging. The balance isn't swinging super hard. And that can mean that some of the power may not be getting through. Also, it could be because of the mainspring. All right, it's kicking up a little bit, though, with a full wind. And sometimes you just got to take a minute, It's just so great to see these things come back to life. Okay, well, let's continue here. We'll put this on the microscope so that we can do the oiling of the jewels, a little bit of small, if you will. And we'll go ahead and put that right on those jewels. This will act as a lubricant between the metal pivot and the ruby jewel. In this case, some of them are metal on metal, including the center wheel here. Normally I would use medium oil for that, but I'm actually going to use light or small because this is such a small watch. It's not under a ton of power. Now we can turn over the watch and take off this little cover, which goes on the bottom of the balance jewel. So the big balance wheel that's spinning on the other side, this is the jewel on the bottom of that. And what we'll do is clean it in some solvent. So this will take away any of the excess oil, dirt, anything that's left on it. And then we can put a very small drop of oil, as you see here, right in the center of it. And then I can replace this little cover and it'll suspend that oil right above the pivot, right where it's needed. That'll help this watch run fast and clean and also for a long time. Okay, with the bottom part done, we can now turn our attention to the top where I have disassembled the balance assembly itself. You can see there's the wheel, there's the bridge, and I'm just going to make sure that everything gets its own thorough cleaning here. The jewels, the bridge itself, the wheel with the spring on it, everything. And this is something that you have to do on these very old watches, is you have to completely disassemble the balance bridge. And it's actually pretty tricky business to do so, but it's the only way to do it. On modern ones, if you've watched my channel, you see I kind of take apart that top part while it's on the microscope, clean it, and then reinstall it. It's a much easier way to do it, but that's not how these were designed. So now I've put a little bit of oil on this. I have to very carefully set it on top so that it doesn't get moved around, and then replace these two tiny little screws. And then I have to put back the spring and the wheel back on. And now once again, with it cleaned and lubricated, we can do so. It is a pain. That is one of the downsides to working on very old watches like this, is they can be really tough. And once again, I'll go ahead and put the balance back on, and thankfully it kicks right back up again now that it's been cleaned. Okay, so with that done, we can put it on the time grapher and let's see what it wants to do. Well, not a great reading there. We want that to be more of a flat line, but overall pretty low amplitude, and it's keeping about a minute a day. That's probably pretty acceptable for a watch like this, given its age and the way that it's going to be used. This isn't a sports watch, right? I can actually be pretty happy with a minute a day on something like this. You can see that dial, really cool. Those numerals are called Breguet numerals, named after the extremely important and famous watchmaker Abraham Louis Breguet, who occasionally used these and popularized that type of numeral. Boy, the dial and hands on this are beautiful too. Yes, they're worn, right? You can see that it doesn't look shiny and brand new, but God, that looks nice. Okay, so we can line up the hand. Again, only 2 hands on this watch. And what I'll do here is gently push the minute hand into place and then get it aligned, and then I'll fully press it in. So here, just a little half press. It's not actually installed properly quite yet, but I can move that over to get it lined up just right and then press it into place. And that's all it takes. And a quick check just to make sure that the hands are lining up properly and not hitting each other. And now we can pay a little bit of attention to the crystal. Now, this crystal is actually in very good shape. There's no big cracks or dings. There's a little bit of light scratches on it, but really nothing to worry about. My guess is that this crystal had been replaced at some point. It would be pretty unlikely for this thing to stay in this condition for, pushing 100 years. But that's fine. These are made to be replaced. And I'm just going to use some Polywatch, which is like a crystal polish, just to get it back up to looking perfect so we can show off that beautiful dial underneath. And now we're right down the home stretch on this reassembly. All I need to do is install the crystal and then put the movement back in the case, and it is a done deal. This is one of the really cool things about this hobby, is you get to be a little bit of a detective, right? Me and the owner, we searched around online. We found that article that I showed you at the beginning from the London Gazette about sort of the business dealings of this Charles & Co. We looked up the time frames to try to figure out, because, a lot of times if you inherit something like this, you don't know a lot about it. And when it's a obscure brand like Charles & Co., which isn't around and, wasn't even a full-on watch brand at the time, it can be really difficult. But if you're willing to dig in a little bit, you can actually kind of unveil the history and the story of these little watches. And I'm just so happy to see it running and looking great. And I can give it back to the owner, and she can enjoy it for years to come and maybe even pass it down herself. Take a look at this watch. Isn't that beautiful? It's a really cool design, very elegant, really nice in that 9-karat gold. It just carries a cool color, and it ended up coming out beautifully. Thank you so much for joining me for this restoration. I really appreciate you taking time once again to hang out with me and go on these little adventures on my bench. I'm really glad that you decided to take the time to. If you want to follow me on Instagram, I do have an account there. It's wristwatch_revival. With that, we'll see you next time.